If you have a person in your life, and let's face it, we all have such people in our lives, who still dutifully votes for the Democrats out of some unfortunate confluence of tribal loyalty, misplaced moral superiority, and crippling inattention to detail, I would encourage you to encourage them to sit down and watch yesterday's hearing of the Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, and to see how their party that they vote for treats its own journalists when they get too close to the wire at the Biden plantation like they are filthy criminals. It's my firm belief that if every Democrat voter watched this hearing, there would be a lot fewer Democrat voters. This hearing and these hearings, they're a good and proper thing. But the antics of the Democrats on the committee, people watching this 75 years from now are going to facepalm just as hard as we ourselves facepalm when we watch the old films of sweaty drunk Joe McCarthy demanding to know if the witness is now or ever has been a member of the Communist Party. And in sweaty drunk Joe McCarthy's defense, he was at least engaged in the pursuit of truth. And there actually were card-carrying communists inside the federal government. And our country paid a terrible price for that fact in terms of the global strategic balance of power. The whole world paid a terrible price for it. If not for the successes of Soviet espionage, first in infiltrating the Manhattan Project, then in infiltrating the federal bureaucracy in the period from 1943 to 1952, is there ever a Cold War? Does Eastern Europe spend 40 years under the boot of communist tyranny? Does Vladimir Putin have nuclear weapons today? The answer to all of those questions is no. So say whatever the hell you want about Joe McCarthy in terms of his methods and his personal comportment and character, but don't try to say the problem he was investigating was just a figment of his own booze-soaked imagination, because it wasn't. Meanwhile, back on Capitol Hill in the present day, Matt Taibbi is probably the most prominent liberal journalist of the last 25 years even, at least in terms of people who can credibly describe themselves as journalists. Nobody in print media has a more distinguished track record of cheerleading for the left and bashing the right than this guy does. This guy has won every leftist journalism award that exists, but did that help him yesterday? Nope. Because that's where we are now. You have two choices if you're a journalist. You can crap like a trained seal and affirm all of the regime's narratives and talking points, or you can be proclaimed a right-wing MAGA conspiracy theorist and permanently excluded from polite society, even if you are Matt freaking Taibbi. And it was hard not to feel bad for the guy, if I'm being honest, because he seemed to have no idea he was going to be ambushed by the Democrats. And Matt Taibbi, he's not a guy who's great at disguising it when he thinks someone has just said something incredibly stupid. So the ranking Democrat on the committee, a spot they gave to a non-voting member from the Virgin Islands for some reason, which seems pretty bizarre, she casually looked right at Matt Taibbi and called him a so-called journalist. And Taibbi, of course, scoffs right out loud and looks around at everybody like, "Are you hearing this? This is mental." I think he thought his decades of being a reliable liberal Democrat writer were going to count for something. But they didn't. Because he has committed deadly sin number one of all, and that's questioning the official media Democrat complex narrative. He wants to give to the public the maximum amount of information about Twitter coordinating with the government to crush the First Amendment rights of ordinary Americans, and let people decide for themselves what they think about it and draw their own conclusions about what it means. But that's not allowed anymore. You can't do that. You can either write what we want you to write, or you can be destroyed. But seriously, do make your ignorant Democrat friends and family members watch this hearing. Confront them with the things they support, with their mindless partisan voting habits. Let them watch this entire sad spectacle, and then positively affirm, yes, this is what I believe in. I think it's great when journalists are slandered and intimidated by members of Congress for reporting the news. And when they say it, if they say it, go ahead and tell them everything else they have also affirmed. And tell it to them just like this. You have no political philosophy. You do not believe in anything. You just want bad things to happen to the people you don't like. And if bad things are happening to the people you don't like, then you are in favor of it. And you don't much care about the details. You do not want a free and open society. You have no interest in a vigorous and spirited debate on the direction of the country and the issues of the day. You do not value liberty or democracy. You just want your enemies to suffer. You just want the people you disagree with to be censored and silenced and thrown out of the public square. This is nothing but a football game for people like you. You just want the team you root for to win the game in the end, and you don't give a damn if they cheat. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where there is an actual castle in tonight's story for a change. Really excited about that. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And you know what else I am? I am a man who loves viewer-requested historical topics, and that is what we are doing tonight. We're going to talk about the Battle of Chapultepec, 13 September 1847, probably the decisive battle of the Mexican-American War, because when Chapultepec Castle fell to the Americans, the gates to Mexico City effectively lay open, and it was largely a matter of walking in and occupying the place. But the most lasting cultural legacy of this battle is the opening stanza of the Marine hymn, which says, "From the halls of Montezuma," which refers specifically to the capture of Chapultepec Castle. And I guess there's one myth we should dispel here right at the outset. It is commonly assumed, since the battle has such pride of place right at the beginning of the Marine hymn, that it was somehow exclusively or primarily a Marine Corps operation. But it totally wasn't. Out of the total 7,000 strong force, there were only about 400 Marines present, of which 40 were assigned to the detachment of 250 men who were sent in to storm the castle after the artillery bombardment was finished. And it's those 40 who are the subject of the line in the song. And if you're asking, why would the Marines make a battle in which they played such a comparatively minor role so prominent in their own mythology? Well, it's a good question, and I'm glad you asked. Now, in the present day, there is nothing remarkable or noteworthy about large groups of Marines fighting in places that are hundreds or even thousands of miles away from any ocean. But in 1847, not so much. Back then, in the mid-19th century, Marines were still pretty close to their original reason for existing. They were naval infantry whose primary jobs were enforcing shipboard discipline and occasionally fighting small engagements on shore if the need should arise. If it's 1847 and Marines are fighting on land, it's almost a guarantee that they can see the ocean from where they are. So when 400 Marines joined the Army column and marched deep into the Mexican interior to assist in the capture of the enemy capital, well, that was a pretty noteworthy thing. Having Marines fighting hundreds of miles inland, that's pretty unusual. And fighting with valor and distinction, no less. So that's why the Marine Corps made the work of these 400 men, or 40 men even, such a celebrated part of their battle record. As for the proximate causes of the larger Mexican-American War, that's a topic that would require its own video, but that can all be summed up pretty quickly. Since the Battle of San Jacinto and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1836, Texas has been an independent country. The United States wants to annex Texas, and the Texians are very eager to be annexed. But Mexico wants to erase the shame of the earlier defeat by pulling a reconquista and taking Texas back. So there quite obviously is going to be armed conflict before the question is settled, and the conflict winds up taking place between 1846 and 1848, though as a practical matter, the thing was all over but the crying as soon as Chapultepec Castle had fallen in the late summer of 1847. And there's another thing that jumps out at you when you look at the roster of the American personnel who were involved in the march inland from Veracruz and the fall of Chapultepec and the subsequent capture of Mexico City. Because it reads like a who's who of every prominent military and political figure in the next 20 years of U.S. history, and particularly the Civil War period. Here is just a partial list. General Winfield Scott, General Future President Franklin Pierce, General Gideon Johnson Pillow, Captain Robert E. Lee, Captain Ulysses S. Grant, Lieutenant Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, Colonel William Truesdale, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph E. Johnston, Lieutenant Raphael Semmes, Lieutenant George Pickett, Lieutenant James Longstreet, Lieutenant John C. Pemberton for you Coca-Cola fans, and Lieutenant Thomas Jonathan Jackson, better known as a general named Stonewall. It's not overstating the matter to say nearly the entire future Confederate general staff was directly involved in this battle. It might also surprise you to learn that there was a battalion of U.S. Army deserters fighting on the Mexican side that day. They were called the St. Patrick's Battalion, or El Batalón San Patricio, depending on whose side you're on. We can't really call them American deserters because technically pretty much none of them were American. They were immigrants, the majority Irish, nearly all of them Catholic, who had become disillusioned with U.S. military service for one reason or another and were successfully recruited to the other side. Their number was somewhere between 200 and 300 by most accounts. And in addition to the Irish, you had Germans, Canadians, French, Italians, Spaniards, Englishmen, Italians, Poles, Scots, even a few Swiss. If it surprises you that there were that many foreign immigrants from that many countries serving in the U.S. Army, it shouldn't. It's been that way pretty much since the Revolution, and it kept being that way for many years after the Mexican War, as evidenced by the fact that more than half of the men who died with Custer at Little Bighorn in 1876 were Germans. I'm serious. If you go to the battlefield and start reading the names on the memorial plaque, which I personally have done, one gets the feeling that one might as well be reading the Dusseldorf phone book. But as you might expect, for a force of deserters who fight on the losing side, the story of St. Patrick's Battalion has a decidedly non-happy ending, as they were all captured en masse and summarily hanged on the morning after the battle. On the Mexican side, how to put this politely, let's just say the Mexicans are not a nation of people who have numerous military victories to celebrate. So, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. You find something to be proud of in a crushing defeat that led to the capture of your national capital. And for Mexico, that point of pride is Los Niños Heros, the 6 Mexican military cadets aged 13 to 19, as they came to be known after they refused the order to evacuate Chapultepec Castle and opted instead to fight to the death. The last of the survivors, Juan Escutia, or so the legend goes, he declared that no Yankee invader was ever going to lay his filthy hands on the Mexican flag, so he wrapped himself up in the banner and bravely leapt to his death, rather than seeing it captured by the enemy. It's a nice story, and I will take no position on its historical veracity, and this is probably a good spot to share a famous quote from Santa Anna that he uttered immediately after the end of the battle. Quote, "I believe if we were to plant our batteries in hell, the damn Yankees would take them from us." End quote. Yep, pretty much. Thanks for playing. And if you're saying, wait, why did they have teenage kids defending this crucial approach to the national capital? Well, the answer to that question is because Chapultepec Castle isn't really a castle, per se, in the sense of the word where it was built as a defensive fortification. It was actually built as a luxury residence, having some of the architectural accoutrements of a castle, but it was never designed to withstand an actual assault, much less with 24-pounder artillery guns. By 1847, the place had been remodeled and converted into the Mexican Army's military academy. So that's why there were a fairly large number of teenage cadets who were among the defenders that day. Santa Anna's big tactical problem is that he doesn't have sufficient forces to defend both the southern approaches to the capital and the western approaches, and if either one fails, well, he is screwed. He knows the size and disposition of the enemy forces such that they're likely to make a feint against one of the targets and mount the real attack against the other. So he decides to make his stand at the castle in the belief that holding it is the only realistic possibility of forestalling a defeat. But this was not a brilliant decision on his part, because the castle was such a useless piece of shit as a defensive fortification that it would have fallen, and fairly quickly, no matter how many men they tried to defend it with. Why? Well, for starters, they only had 7 guns in the place. 2 24-pounders, 1 8-pounder, 3 4-pounders. Meanwhile, the Americans have the entire place ringed with 24-pounders, so you do the math. The defenders have only got 2 guns that can match the range of the attackers' guns, and they can't have them everywhere at once. So for the Americans, it's a simple matter of reducing the place to rubble and then going in and capturing or killing whoever remains alive afterward. The Mexicans did whatever they could to try and shore the place up. They dug some trenches, filled some sandbags, but it didn't matter. The unreinforced stone walls of the castle, they basically melted like butter each time they were hit by the U.S. artillery, and the defenders couldn't do a damn thing about it. And this began to have a demoralizing effect, as these things often do. And some men began abandoning their posts and fleeing for their lives. For Santa Anna's part, the bombardment of the castle went on for an entire day before he became convinced that this really was the main attack and not a feint. He consults with his top general, General Bravo, and he says, "General, I want you to pull your men off the southern causeways and send them up here to assist with the defense of the castle." And General Bravo says, "Sir, with all due respect, if I give that order, my entire army is going to desert. This battle is already over, and we lost." The bombardment continues from dawn till dusk, at which point whatever meager value the castle had as a defensive position is well and truly over. The artillery units start firing again at first light on the morning of the 13th, but after a couple of hours, realizing there's not much of the outer perimeter left to destroy, General Scott orders the infantry assault to commence. 2 teams of 250 men each, including our 40 Marines. They form up in 3 columns. On the left, we have elements of the 11th and 14th Infantry Divisions under Colonel Truesdale. In the center, we have 4 companies of the Voltigeur Regiment under Colonel Timothy Patrick Andrews. On the right are 4 additional companies from that same regiment, under the command of the aforementioned Lieutenant Colonel and future Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. Now, everybody sort of figured the final assault was going to be something of a cakewalk, since many of the defenders had already fled or been killed, and many of those who remained were rather severely demoralized. But the Americans wind up taking surprisingly heavy casualties, owing in part to the fact that nobody remembered to bring any ladders with which to scale the sections of the outer castle walls that still remain standing. So while they're all standing around waiting for the ladders to arrive, the commander of the 9th Infantry Division, Colonel Truman B. Ransom, he gets killed outright by a lucky rifle shot from high atop the battlements, so to speak. The overall commander of the assault, General Pillow, is also struck and wounded and has to be carried from the field. And for a tenuous few minutes, it looks like the assault may falter, but it doesn't. As he's being carried away, General Pillow requests reinforcements, and General John A. Quitman, former and future governor of Mississippi, provides them. And they bring ladders. So within a matter of 90 minutes or so, the Voltigeurs and the 2nd Pennsylvania Regiment have both planted the Stars and Stripes on the parapets of the castle. By a little after 9 o'clock, General Bravo has surrendered his sword to the New York Regiment, and the battle is over. Santa Anna, he watches the whole thing play out from his Mexico City headquarters just a few miles away. And he knows he has lost far more than a battle. He has lost the larger war. Texas will never again be Mexican. All Mexican lands north of the 20th parallel will be forfeit. American territory will now extend from sea to shining sea. And it wouldn't be the last time we would invade Mexico. 68 years later, in 1915, President Wilson ordered General John Pershing to enter Mexico, locate the gangster and criminal Pancho Villa and his Confederates, liquidate them with extreme prejudice. Why? Because Villa and his men had killed 12 Americans in a raid across the border into New Mexico. 12 Americans, obviously, is a lot less than 100,000. But that's how many Americans are currently being killed each and every year by the current generation of Mexican criminal gangsters. So I leave you to ponder the question until next we meet. If 100,000 dead Americans per year is not sufficient cause for invading Mexico, liquidating every single cartel scumbag we can find, and replacing their failed narco government with a real government, then what would sufficient cause actually look like? Thanks very much indeed for watching. Have a pleasant weekend. See you next time. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.